Marcus Chen thought he knew what fear felt like. He jumped out of planes, climbed frozen waterfalls, and spent nights alone in places most people wouldn't dare enter during daylight. But standing in the parking lot of Westfield Shopping Complex at 11:47 p.m., staring at the darkened entrance of what was once America's third-largest mall, he realized he'd been playing in the shallow end of terror his entire life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The challenge seemed simple enough when his roommate Tyler first pitched it during their usual Thursday night poker game. Survive 24 hours alone inside the abandoned Westfield complex. No outside contact. No backup plan. Just Marcus, his wits, and whatever he could carry in a single backpack. The prize? $5,000 from each of the 6 guys around that table. $30,000 total. Enough to pay off his student loans and maybe, just maybe, prove to himself that he wasn't the coward his ex-girlfriend Rachel had called him before she walked out 3 months ago. What Marcus didn't know as he approached those glass doors was that Westfield Complex had been closed for exactly 13 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days. What he didn't know was that the last security guard to patrol these halls had quit after reporting impossible sounds coming from the old food court. And what he absolutely couldn't have known was that some challenges aren't meant to be won. They're meant to change you completely. The lock clicked open easier than expected. Tyler had done his homework, somehow acquiring a master key from his cousin, who'd worked maintenance before the mall's closure. Marcus pushed through the heavy glass door, and the smell hit him immediately. Stale air mixed with something else, something organic and wrong. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing the skeletal remains of what had once been a thriving commercial paradise. Westfield Complex stretched out before him like a concrete cavern. The main corridor disappeared into blackness in both directions, punctuated by the ghostly outlines of shuttered storefronts. Above, the second and third levels created a maze of balconies and walkways that seemed to shift and multiply in the dancing shadows of his flashlight. The fountain in the center courtyard sat dry and cracked, its decorative tiles now home to strange, dark stains that Marcus chose not to examine too closely. He'd studied the mall's layout obsessively for 2 weeks. 3 levels, 4 major anchor stores, over 200 smaller shops, 6 restaurants, and a 12-screen movie theater. During its heyday, Westfield had employed nearly 3,000 people and welcomed over 50,000 visitors daily. Now it stood as a monument to economic collapse and urban decay, another casualty of online shopping and changing consumer habits. Marcus had entered through the old Macy's entrance on the east side. His plan was methodical. Establish a base camp in the former Barnes & Noble on the 2nd level, where the large windows would provide natural light come morning. From there, he'd systematically explore each section, documenting everything with his phone camera for the guys back home. Simple, professional, boring enough to win the bet, and interesting enough to make good content for his struggling YouTube channel. The escalators stood frozen like metallic waterfalls. Marcus tested the first step. Solid, but he opted for the stairs instead. Better to save battery life and avoid any mechanical surprises. As he climbed, his footsteps echoed strangely, creating a rhythm that seemed to continue even after he stopped moving. He paused, listening. Silence. Then, from somewhere deep in the mall's interior, came a sound like wind chimes made of glass and metal. The 2nd level felt different. Where the ground floor had been merely empty, this felt actively abandoned. Store security gates hung at odd angles, some torn completely free from their moorings. Merchandise lay scattered across the walkways. A child's sneaker here, a romance novel there, a mannequin head staring up at him with painted eyes that seemed too real in the flashlight beam. Marcus found the old Barnes & Noble and used Tyler's key collection to open the security gate. Inside, the store was a bibliophile's nightmare. Books lay scattered everywhere, their pages yellow and brittle. Shelves had toppled domino-style, creating paper mountains and literary valleys. But the back office was intact, complete with a desk, chairs, and most importantly, windows facing the parking lot where he could see his Honda Civic waiting like a promise of eventual escape. He set up his sleeping bag on the office floor and arranged his supplies: water for 3 days, energy bars, a first aid kit, 2 backup flashlights, a portable phone charger, and his grandfather's old Polaroid camera, a quirky addition he'd thrown in for atmosphere. The office became his command center, his sanctuary in this retail graveyard. The first hour passed uneventfully. Marcus explored the immediate area, mapping out the nearby stores and noting potential hazards. Hot dog on a stick still had its distinctive red and blue striping, though the colors had faded to something resembling dried blood and mold. Spencer's retained its rebellious aesthetic, but the novelty items scattered across its floor had taken on a sinister quality in the darkness. A rubber skull grinned at him from beneath a display of fake jewelry, and he could swear its empty sockets tracked his movement as he passed. By 1 a.m., Marcus was feeling confident. This was just an empty building, nothing more. The sounds he'd been hearing were probably just the structure settling, or maybe small animals that had found ways inside. Urban exploration was all about managing fear and expectations, and he'd done plenty of both during his preparation. That confidence began to crack during his exploration of the old Radio Shack. The store was tiny, barely larger than a closet, but something about it felt wrong. The electronics displays were still intact, showing phones and gadgets from the early 2000s. Dust covered everything except for one small section of the counter, which appeared to have been recently cleaned. Marcus approached carefully, his flashlight revealing what looked like fresh fingerprints in the dust surrounding the clean area. He was examining the prints when he heard it clearly for the first time. Footsteps, not his own. These came from above, on the third level, moving with purpose and direction. Marcus froze, listening as the footsteps passed directly overhead, then continued down what sounded like the main corridor. The logical explanation was simple. Despite Tyler's assurances, security still patrolled the building. Marcus was trespassing, and he'd been caught. The smart move was to call out, identify himself, and accept whatever consequences came with getting kicked out. He'd lose the bet, but he'd avoid legal trouble. Instead, he found himself following the sound. The third level required another climb, this time up a stairwell that reeked of something metallic and sharp. His flashlight revealed why. Rust stains covered the handrails and steps, though the building's metal fixtures should have been treated to prevent corrosion. The stains were too red, too organic-looking. They reminded Marcus of the time he'd cut his hand badly while camping, and had left bloody handprints on everything he touched afterward. The third level was the mall's original anchor, built in the 1970s when Westfield was just a small community shopping center. The architecture was different here. Lower ceilings, narrower corridors, a more intimate scale that somehow felt more threatening than the grand spaces below. The stores were smaller, too, many of them specialty shops that had catered to niche interests. A hobby store, a fabric shop, a place that had sold nothing but candles and incense. Marcus followed the footsteps' path as best he could determine, moving slowly to avoid making noise. The sounds had stopped, but something drew him forward. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the same impulse that had led him to accept the challenge in the first place. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Something that had been waiting in the darkness for exactly the right person to come looking. He found the source of his attraction in what had once been a children's clothing store called Tiny Treasures. The shop was smaller than Radio Shack, barely large enough for a handful of display racks. But unlike every other store he'd explored, this one showed signs of recent habitation. A sleeping bag lay spread in one corner, though it was far too small for an adult. Children's clothes hung neatly on makeshift lines strung between the walls. Clean clothes, recently washed, in sizes that would fit kids between 5 and 10 years old. A small camping stove sat on an improvised table made from a cardboard box, and beside it, still warm to the touch, was a cup of what smelled like hot chocolate. Marcus's hands were shaking as he swept his flashlight across the scene. Someone lived here. Someone small, and they'd been here recently enough that their hot chocolate hadn't finished cooling. The footsteps he'd followed belonged to a child. A child who was living alone in an abandoned shopping mall, 3 stories above the ground, in a building that had been officially empty for over a year. A child who had somehow acquired clothing, food, and camping equipment. A child who had just walked past this room while Marcus was exploring below, and who was now somewhere in the darkness, probably watching him discover their secret home. Marcus called out softly, "Hello? I'm not going to hurt you. I'm just visiting." The silence that answered felt heavy with anticipation. as if the entire mall was holding its breath. Then, from somewhere much closer than seemed possible, came the sound of a child giggling. Not the innocent laughter of a kid at play, but something else. Something that made Marcus's skin crawl and his rational mind start cataloging all the reasons why a child living alone in an abandoned mall was the least of his problems. Because children don't usually giggle in the dark. And they definitely don't giggle when they're supposed to be alone. Marcus was beginning to realize that his 24-hour challenge had become something entirely different. Something that wouldn't end with sunrise and a drive home to collect his winnings. Something that was just getting started. The giggling stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving Marcus alone with the rapid beating of his own heart and the metallic taste of adrenaline flooding his mouth. He remained perfectly still, flashlight trained on the makeshift living space, trying to process what he'd stumbled into. The hot chocolate cup sat there like evidence of an impossible crime, too fresh to ignore, too strange to accept. Minutes passed. 5, 10. The silence stretched until Marcus began to question whether he'd heard anything at all. Maybe the stress of the challenge was getting to him. Maybe the giggling had been a pipe settling, or wind moving through the building's ventilation system. Maybe the warm cup was just residual heat from the day, trapped in ceramic and slowly dissipating. He was almost ready to accept these rational explanations when he heard his name. Marcus. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Not shouted. Not whispered. Spoken in a normal conversational tone, as if someone was standing right beside him. But his flashlight revealed only empty space and abandoned retail fixtures. The voice had been distinctly young, maybe 8 or 9 years old, with the clear pronunciation of someone who'd been well-educated despite their current circumstances. "Who's there?" Marcus called back, surprised by how steady his own voice sounded. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to talk." "I know why you're here, Marcus. Tyler told me you'd be coming." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Tyler knew about this child? His roommate had sent him into a building where a kid was living alone, without warning him, without mentioning the obvious safety and legal implications. Marcus's mind raced through possibilities. Maybe this was part of the challenge. Maybe Tyler had arranged for someone's little brother or sister to mess with his head, to make the 24 hours more difficult than anticipated. But that didn't explain the living space, the carefully organized supplies, or the fact that this child had apparently been residing in an abandoned building for an extended period. "Where are you?" Marcus asked, turning slowly to scan the area around him. "Come out so I can see you. We should talk about getting you somewhere safe." "I am somewhere safe," the voice replied, and now it seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Above him, to his left, echoing from the corridor behind him. "This is my home. Tyler promised you wouldn't try to make me leave." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mall's temperature. Tyler had made promises to this child. His roommate knew about a kid living alone in dangerous conditions, and had not only failed to report it to authorities, but had actually made arrangements to protect the situation. The $30,000 bet suddenly seemed less like friendly competition and more like payment for something much more sinister. "What did Tyler tell you exactly?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice gentle while his mind worked through increasingly dark possibilities. "He said you were different. He said you would understand why someone might need to hide. He said you wouldn't ask too many questions, or try to fix things that aren't broken." Quote. The voice was moving now, and Marcus caught glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision, small shadows shifting just beyond the reach of his flashlight beam. The child was circling him, staying just out of sight while maintaining their conversation. It was a predatory behavior that seemed far too sophisticated for someone so young. "Tyler was wrong," Marcus said firmly. "I ask lots of questions, and I definitely try to fix things that are broken, starting with figuring out why a kid is living alone in an abandoned mall instead of being home with their family." The laughter came again, but this time it wasn't giggling. It was genuine amusement, the kind of laugh that comes from hearing something truly funny. "Family," the voice repeated, as if the word itself was a joke. "Marcus, when was the last time you talked to yours?" The question caught Marcus off guard. He'd been estranged from his parents since college, Their relationship strained by arguments over his choice of major, his lifestyle, his refusal to follow the predetermined path they'd laid out for him. His last conversation with his mother had been 6 months ago, a stilted phone call that had ended with both of them making excuses to hang up. His father hadn't spoken to him in over a year. "That's different," Marcus said, though he wasn't sure why he was defending himself to a child hiding in the darkness. "I'm an adult. I can take care of myself." "So can I." The simple statement carried more weight than it should have. There was no defensiveness in the child's tone, no bravado or false confidence. Just a matter-of-fact declaration from someone who had apparently been proving their self-sufficiency for quite some time. Marcus decided to try a different approach. "What's your name?" "Names are for people who exist in the regular world. I stopped going there a long time ago." "Everyone has a name." "Everyone has lots of names. The question is which one you choose to use. Tyler calls me Ghost. The security guards who used to work here called me Problem. The social workers called me Case File 47B Delta. My parents called me Mistake." The casual way the child delivered this information was more disturbing than any amount of screaming or crying would have been. Marcus had worked with troubled kids during his brief stint as a substitute teacher, and he recognized the emotional detachment that came from systematic trauma. This wasn't a runaway adventure or teenage rebellion. This was survival. "How long have you been living here?" Marcus asked. "Time gets weird when you don't follow clocks anymore. Long enough to know every sound this building makes. Long enough to figure out which stores have the softest floors for sleeping, and which bathrooms still have running water. Long enough to understand that the outside world forgot about this place completely, which makes it perfect for someone who needs to be forgotten too." Marcus's flashlight beam swept across the small living space again, taking in details he'd missed during his initial shock. The child's setup was remarkably sophisticated. They had multiple sources of light: candles, battery-powered lanterns, even what looked like a small solar charger positioned near a skylight. Food was stored in sealed containers, organized and rationed like a military supply depot. Clothes were sorted by size and season, suggesting the child had been growing during their time in the mall and had somehow acquired new garments to accommodate their changing body. "This is impressive," Marcus admitted, "but it's not sustainable. What happens when winter comes? What happens if you get sick or hurt? What happens when the building owners decide to demolish this place? What happens when your parents decide they're disappointed in you? What happens when your girlfriend leaves because you're not ambitious enough? What happens when you realize that all the people you thought cared about you were just waiting for you to become someone else?" Marcus felt like he'd been punched. The child had somehow extracted deeply personal information about his life, information that Tyler might have shared but probably hadn't. His relationship with Rachel, his struggles with his family, his sense of being perpetually inadequate in everyone else's eyes. These weren't things he discussed casually, even with close friends. "How do you know about Rachel?" he asked. "I know lots of things. When you spend enough time alone, you get good at reading people. And when people think they're alone, they show you who they really are." A new possibility occurred to Marcus, one that made his skin crawl. "Have you been watching me since I got here?" "I've been watching everyone who comes here. The urban explorers with their cameras and their YouTube channels. The homeless people are looking for a warm place to sleep. The teenagers who dare each other to spend an hour in the quote haunted mall. The drug dealers who think empty buildings make good meeting spots. The social workers who came looking for missing kids." The child paused, and Marcus could hear movement again. Footsteps moving closer. "You're the first one Tyler sent specifically to find me." Marcus's blood ran cold. Tyler hadn't just known about the child. He'd sent Marcus here deliberately, as some kind of test or trial. The bet, the challenge, the $30,000, it was all a setup for this moment. But why? What was Tyler's connection to this kid, and what did he expect Marcus to do about the situation? "Where is Tyler now?" Marcus asked. "Home, probably. Waiting to see if you pass or fail." "Pass or fail what?" "The real challenge." Before Marcus could ask what that meant, he heard new sounds from the levels below. The unmistakable noise of the main entrance opening and closing, followed by multiple sets of footsteps moving through the mall. Heavy footsteps. Adult footsteps. Moving with purpose and coordination. "Looks like the others are here early," the child's voice said, and for the first time, Marcus detected a note of concern. They weren't supposed to come until tomorrow night. What others? Marcus demanded, but the child was already moving, their footsteps receding rapidly down the corridor. Stay quiet, the voice called back. Don't use your flashlight. Don't let them find you. If they catch you before midnight, the challenge ends badly for both of us. Marcus was left alone in the tiny store, surrounded by children's clothing and camping equipment, listening to the sound of unknown people searching the mall below. His phone showed 2:47 a.m. Midnight was still 21 hours away. And somewhere in the building, people were hunting for him. People who weren't supposed to be there yet. People whose presence clearly worried even a child who had survived alone in this place for months. He turned off his flashlight and tried to think. Tyler had set him up, but for what? The child, Ghost, seemed to know more about the situation than they were revealing. And now there were others in the building. Others who apparently had some kind of schedule or plan that involved midnight deadlines and challenges that could end badly. Marcus realized he had two choices: try to escape the building immediately and forfeit whatever game Tyler had trapped him in, or stay and learn the truth about what was really happening. The smart choice was obvious. The safe choice was clear. But as he listened to the footsteps below growing more organized and systematic, as he heard voices calling to each other in low, professional tones, Marcus understood that leaving might not be an option anymore. The main entrance he'd used was on the ground level, directly in the path of whoever was searching the building. The emergency exits might be alarmed or locked from the outside. And even if he could escape, he'd be abandoning a child who clearly needed help, regardless of how capable they claimed to be. The footsteps were getting closer. Marcus could hear them on the second level now, moving through the stores with practiced efficiency. They weren't random intruders or casual trespassers. These people knew the building layout, had equipment, and were following some kind of systematic search pattern. Marcus made his decision. He would stay, find out what Tyler had gotten him into, and make sure Ghost remained safe. The $30,000 no longer mattered. His pride no longer mattered. What mattered was understanding why his roommate had sent him into a situation involving a vulnerable child and unknown adults who apparently had their own agenda for the abandoned mall. He gathered his supplies quickly and quietly, stuffing everything back into his backpack except for his grandfather's Polaroid camera, which he clipped to his belt for easy access. If he was going to be hunted through an abandoned building, he wanted evidence of whatever he discovered. The voices below were getting clearer now. He could hear at least 3 different people, maybe 4, communicating in short, efficient phrases that suggested military or law enforcement training. They weren't looking for Ghost. They were looking for him. Marcus moved carefully toward the back of the small store, where a service corridor connected to the mall's hidden infrastructure. The Ghost had disappeared in this direction, and if the child had survived here for months, they would know every hiding place and escape route the building offered. As he slipped into the narrow corridor, Marcus heard one of the voices below call out clearly, "Marcus Chen, we know you're here. We're not going to hurt you. We just need to talk." They knew his full name, they knew he was in the building, and they were lying about not wanting to hurt him. People who just wanted to talk didn't conduct organized searches of abandoned buildings in the middle of the night. Marcus realized that his 24-hour challenge had become something much more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. Tyler hadn't just bet against him. Tyler had sold him out to people who had their own plans for what would happen in Westfield Complex after midnight. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, Ghost was waiting to show him just how deep the rabbit hole really went. The service corridor was a claustrophobic maze of concrete walls and exposed pipes that ran behind the mall's storefronts like the building's hidden circulatory system. Marcus moved through the narrow space, guided only by the faint luminescence from his phone screen, keeping the brightness at minimum to avoid detection. The corridor smelled of rust, mildew, and something else. Something organic that reminded him of the time a mouse had died inside his apartment walls. Behind him, the searchers had reached the 3rd level. He could hear their voices more clearly now through the thin walls, and what he heard made his situation significantly worse. "Thermal shows movement in the service areas," a woman's voice reported. "He's mobile, heading east toward the old department store section." They had thermal imaging equipment, professional gear that could track his body heat through walls and floors. This wasn't a casual search party or even standard security. These people had come prepared for exactly this scenario. as if hunting someone through Westfield Complex was a routine operation they'd performed before. "Copy that, Elena. Jake, take the north stairwell. Cut him off before he reaches the anchor store. Maria, stay on the main level and monitor the exits. Remember, we need him contained, not cornered. The last thing we want is another incident like Portland." Another incident like Portland. Marcus's mind raced through the implications. These people had done this before, in other locations, and something had gone wrong. Someone had been hurt, or worse. And now they were applying lessons learned from that failure to ensure their current operation went more smoothly. Marcus reached a junction where the service corridor branched in 3 directions. To his left, pipes and ductwork led toward what he remembered being the old Sears anchor store. Straight ahead, the corridor continued toward the center of the mall. To his right, a maintenance ladder led upward, presumably to the building's roof access or mechanical systems. "Marcus," Ghost's voice came from somewhere above him, barely audible. "Up here, quickly." Marcus looked up and saw a ventilation grate that had been partially removed, creating just enough space for a small person to squeeze through. The child had found a way into the building's air circulation system, a network of ducts and shafts that would be invisible to thermal imaging and inaccessible to adult pursuers. "I can't fit through there," Marcus whispered. "Yes, you can. I widened it last month when I knew Tyler was planning something like this. Trust me." Marcus had no better options. The voices behind him were getting closer, and he could hear additional footsteps on the levels below, indicating more searchers had entered the building. He boosted himself up to the ventilation opening and discovered that Ghost had indeed modified the space, removing additional sections of ductwork to create a passage just large enough for an adult to crawl through. The air duct was a horizontal tunnel that stretched into darkness in both directions. Marcus pulled himself inside and immediately understood why Ghost had chosen this as their highway through the building. The ducts were insulated and soundproofed, muffling external noise while allowing whispered conversation. More importantly, they provided access to every part of the mall without being detected by security cameras, motion sensors, or thermal imaging. "This way," Ghost's voice came from ahead, accompanied by the soft sound of someone moving expertly through the confined space. "We need to get to the central hub before they lock down the building." Marcus crawled forward, his backpack scraping against the duct walls despite his efforts to move quietly. The space was just wide enough for his shoulders, just tall enough for him to lift his head. It was like being inside a mechanical birth canal, being reborn into a world where the normal rules of architecture and movement no longer applied. "How long have you been planning escape routes like this?" Marcus asked. "Since the first week I was here. The mall's original blueprints are in the old management office. I studied them until I knew every pipe, every wire, every space between the walls. When you live somewhere, really live there, you learn its secrets." They crawled in silence for several minutes, navigating turns and intersections that Ghost seemed to know by heart. Through ventilation grates, Marcus caught glimpses of the mall below, flashlight beams sweeping through abandoned stores, the organized movement of people who clearly knew what they were doing. "Who are they?" Marcus asked when they paused at another junction. "Tyler calls them facilitators. They handle the logistics for his challenges. Make sure participants don't quit early, don't call for help, don't document things they shouldn't document. Tyler runs challenges like this regularly. Every few months, different people, different locations, but the same basic structure. Someone gets dared or bet into spending time alone in an abandoned place. They think it's about proving their courage or winning money. But it's actually about something else entirely." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool air moving through the ducts. "What else?" "Data collection, psychological profiling, testing how people respond to isolation, fear, and moral dilemmas. Tyler works for a company that studies human behavior under extreme conditions. The challenges are experiments, and the participants are test subjects." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. Tyler wasn't his friend betting against him in a stupid dare. Tyler was a researcher studying him, documenting his responses to carefully designed stressors. The abandoned mall, the mysterious child, the late-night hunters. All of it was orchestrated to push Marcus into specific emotional and psychological states, while observers recorded his reactions. "That's why they have thermal imaging," Marcus realized. "They need to monitor everything I do." "Exactly. Your heart rate, your movement patterns, your decision-making under pressure. They probably have audio recording devices planted throughout the building. Maybe video too, though the darkness makes that less useful. And you? Are you part of the experiment? The ghost was quiet for a long moment. When they finally spoke, their voice carried a sadness that seemed far too heavy for someone so young. I was. Experiment designation Ghost Protocol. See how long a minor can survive independently in an urban environment with minimal resources. Monitor psychological adaptation to social isolation. Document the development of survival skills and emotional coping mechanisms. Was? The experiment was supposed to last 6 months. It's been 14. They stopped checking on me regularly after month 8. I think they forgot about me, or decided the data they'd collected was sufficient, or maybe they just moved on to more interesting subjects. Marcus felt sick. Tyler's company had abandoned a child in a dangerous environment as part of a psychological experiment, then left them there when they'd gathered enough information. Ghost had been surviving alone, not by choice, but because the adults responsible for their situation had simply walked away. We have to get you out of here, Marcus said. Get you to social services, or the police, or someone who can help. You still don't understand, Ghost replied. This isn't a rescue mission. This is the final phase of your experiment. Tyler sent you here to find me, to form an emotional connection, to face a moral dilemma about whether to help or abandon a vulnerable child. The facilitators are here to monitor how you handle that decision under pressure. Then we'll both leave, tonight, before they can complete whatever data collection they're planning. That's not how their experiments work. They stack variables until subjects break down completely or achieve some kind of breakthrough. Running away together would be avoiding the core psychological pressure they've designed. They'll just escalate until we're forced to confront the real choice they want to study. Marcus realized that Ghost understood their situation with a clarity that came from months of being studied and analyzed. The child had become an expert on their captor's methods, learning to predict and navigate the psychological manipulations that had become their daily reality. What choice? Marcus asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew. Tyler told me about your girlfriend Rachel, about how she left because you never stood up for anything important, never took responsibility for other people's welfare, never risked yourself for someone else's benefit. This whole scenario is designed to test whether you'll sacrifice your own safety to protect someone who can't protect themselves. They had reached what Ghost called the central hub, a wider section of the ductwork, where several major air circulation routes converged. Through a large ventilation grate, Marcus could see down into the mall's main courtyard, where the facilitators had set up what looked like a mobile command center. Multiple laptops, communication equipment, and monitoring devices were arranged on folding tables. Cables ran from the equipment to various points throughout the building, confirming Ghost's suspicions about surveillance. The real question, Ghost continued, is whether you'll choose to help me escape, even if it means failing their test and facing whatever consequences Tyler has planned for subjects who don't complete their challenges. Marcus studied the command center below. 4 people moved around the equipment with professional efficiency. 3 women and 1 man, all dressed in dark clothing that allowed them to blend into the mall's shadows. They weren't threatening or aggressive in their movements. They looked more like researchers conducting a field study than hunters pursuing prey. But the equipment they'd brought suggested they were prepared for participants who might try to escape or resist the experimental conditions. Marcus could see restraint devices, sedation equipment, and what looked like a portable medical kit designed for handling psychological emergencies. What happens to subjects who don't complete the challenges? Marcus asked. I don't know. I've never seen any of them again after the facilitators took them away. Tyler always has new roommates, new friends, new people to recruit for the next experiment. He's very good at finding lonely people who won't be missed if they disappear for a while. The implications were terrifying. Marcus thought about his own isolation, his estrangement from his family, his lack of close relationships beyond Tyler. He was exactly the kind of person who could vanish without generating significant concern or investigation. Rachel wouldn't report him missing. They weren't in contact. His parents might not notice his absence for months. His coworkers would assume he'd quit without notice, something that happened regularly in his industry. How many people has Tyler recruited? Marcus asked. In the time I've been here, maybe 20 or 30. Different locations, different scenarios, but the same basic pattern. Find someone isolated and vulnerable. Offer them a challenge that appeals to their specific psychological needs. Then study how they respond to increasingly stressful conditions. Marcus realized that Tyler had been running a sophisticated human experimentation program, using abandoned buildings and manufactured crises to collect data on human behavior under extreme conditions. The casual way his roommate had pitched the mall challenge made perfect sense now. It was Tyler's job, refined through dozens of previous trials. "We need evidence," Marcus said. "Photos, recordings, something that proves what they're doing." "I've been collecting evidence for months," Ghost replied. "Hidden cameras, audio recordings, copies of their research notes. Everything is stored in a safe location they don't know about. But evidence doesn't matter if we don't survive to use it." "Where?" "The old movie theater. They never go there because the projection booth is unstable and the screen collapsed years ago. But there's a hidden room behind the concession stand where the theater manager used to count money. I've turned it into my real home. The place in Tiny Treasures is just for show, in case anyone ever found me." Marcus looked down at the command center again. The facilitators were clearly settling in for a long night, arranging their equipment for extended monitoring. One of them was speaking into a headset, probably communicating with Tyler or other researchers who were observing remotely. "The theater is on the ground level," Marcus pointed out. "We'll have to get past them." "Not past them, through them. The ductwork runs directly over their command center. There's a maintenance shaft that drops down into the theater's mechanical room. But we'll have to move while they're focused on searching the upper levels." "When will that be?" "Soon. They've been tracking us through thermal imaging, but the ducts mask our heat signatures. They'll assume we're still hiding in the service corridors and concentrate their search there. That gives us maybe a 10-minute window to reach the theater." Marcus heard footsteps in the corridors below, confirming Ghost's prediction. The facilitators were indeed focusing their search on the areas where thermal imaging had last detected movement. Their professional approach meant they were methodical but also predictable, following standard search protocols that a child who'd been hiding from them for months would have learned to exploit. "After we get the evidence," Marcus said, "then what?" "Then we find out if you're the kind of person who risks everything to help someone else, or the kind of person who saves himself and lets others deal with the consequences." The ghost began moving again, crawling deeper into the ductwork maze toward their destination. Marcus followed, understanding that the next few hours would determine not just whether he survived Tyler's experiment, but who he truly was when everything familiar and safe had been stripped away. The abandoned mall had become a laboratory for studying the human soul under pressure, and Marcus was about to discover what his soul was actually made of. The maintenance shaft that led to the movie theater was a vertical drop that would have terrified Marcus under normal circumstances. Now, with professional researchers hunting him through an abandoned building while a child showed him evidence of systematic human experimentation, the 20-foot descent seemed like the least dangerous part of his evening. The ghost descended first, moving with the fluid confidence of someone who had made this journey countless times. Marcus followed more carefully, his larger frame making the tight space even more challenging. The shaft was lined with service ladders, but many of the rungs were loose or missing entirely, forcing him to brace himself against the walls and lower himself inch by inch. He dropped into the theater's mechanical room, just as his arms began to shake from the strain. The space was cramped and filled with the skeletal remains of projection equipment, massive reels, lenses the size of dinner plates, and electrical systems that looked like they belonged in a museum of early cinema technology. Ghost was already at work, removing a panel from what looked like an ordinary electrical box. Behind the false front was a sophisticated storage system containing multiple hard drives, memory cards, and what appeared to be a portable server setup. "I've been documenting everything," Ghost whispered, powering up one of the devices. Video footage of their setup procedures, audio recordings of their planning sessions, copies of research protocols they thought they deleted from the building's old computer system. The screen came to life, displaying a file directory with dozens of folders organized by date and experiment designation. Marcus saw his own name listed under current operations alongside files labeled with codes like Portland-47, Detroit 23, and Nashville 61. Each folder contained gigabytes of data, enough information to represent months or years of systematic research. "This is incredible," Marcus breathed. "This could shut down their entire operation." "Look at this one first," Ghost said, opening a video file dated 3 months earlier. The footage showed the interior of what looked like an abandoned warehouse. A woman in her 30s was moving through the space with obvious fear, checking corners and jumping at shadows. The timestamp showed the recording had lasted over 8 hours, documenting her progressive psychological breakdown as unseen observers subjected her to increasingly stressful conditions. Detroit 23, Ghost explained. Her name was Sarah Mitchell. Tyler convinced her that spending a night alone in an abandoned auto plant would help her overcome her anxiety about taking a new job. The facilitators used sound effects, moving objects, and staged encounters to push her beyond her breaking point. Marcus watched in horror as the woman on screen became increasingly desperate, talking to herself, crying, eventually curling into a ball in a corner of the warehouse while voices echoed around her from hidden speakers. What happened to her? The experiment ended when she stopped responding to stimuli, complete psychological withdrawal. They classified it as successful data collection and moved on to the next subject. Ghost opened another file, this one showing a man roughly Marcus's age in what appeared to be an abandoned hospital. The subject was being pursued through corridors by figures in medical scrubs, their faces obscured by surgical masks. The man's terror was visceral, primal, as he ran from room to room seeking escape that didn't exist. Nashville 61, David Park. The challenge was to spend 12 hours in a closed psychiatric facility. Tyler told him it was research for a novel he was writing. The facilitators used actors to simulate patient encounters, creating scenarios designed to trigger specific phobias and trauma responses. This is torture, Marcus said. It's research, Ghost corrected. Legal research, conducted with signed consent forms and liability waivers. Tyler is very careful about the paperwork. Every subject agrees to participate in, quote, immersive psychological experiences for academic purposes. They just don't understand what that really means until it's too late. Marcus remembered signing exactly that kind of form, buried in the middle of a stack of papers Tyler had presented as legal stuff for the bet. He'd been so focused on the money and the challenge that he'd barely read the fine print. Now he realized he'd given legal consent to be subjected to whatever psychological manipulation Tyler's researchers deemed necessary for their data collection. The really disturbing part, Ghost continued, opening more files, is how they select subjects. Tyler doesn't just randomly recruit people. He targets individuals with specific psychological profiles, personal trauma, and social isolation. He spends months building relationships with potential subjects, learning their vulnerabilities, identifying the exact type of challenge that will push them past their limits. The screen displayed what looked like a psychological evaluation form with Marcus's name at the top. Tyler had documented everything: his relationship with Rachel, his estrangement from his parents, his financial struggles, his tendency towards self-doubt and people-pleasing behavior. The assessment concluded with a recommendation for abandonment scenario with moral dilemma component as the most effective way to study his stress responses. He's been analyzing me since we became roommates, Marcus realized. Probably since before that. Tyler doesn't form accidental friendships. He cultivates research subjects. Above them, Marcus could hear the facilitators moving through the mall, their search growing more systematic as they realized their quarry had vanished from the thermal imaging scans. Voices carried through the building's ventilation system, coordinating sweep patterns and discussing containment protocols. "We need to get this evidence out of the building," Marcus said. "Get it to the police, the FBI, someone who can stop them." "That's the problem," Ghost replied. "The research is legal, unethical, manipulative, and psychologically damaging, but technically legal. The subjects consent to participate, the experiments don't involve physical harm, and the data is being collected for legitimate academic research." Academic research? This is some kind of university program? Corporate research. Tyler works for a consulting firm that specializes in crisis management and human resources optimization. Companies pay them to understand how employees respond to high-stress situations, how to identify individuals who might break under pressure, how to predict and control human behavior in extreme circumstances. Marcus felt a new wave of nausea. Tyler's experiments weren't just academic curiosity. They were corporate intelligence gathering designed to help businesses manipulate and control their workforce. The data collected from abandoned buildings and manufactured crises was being used to develop more sophisticated methods of psychological manipulation in everyday work environments. The subjects who don't complete the challenges, Marcus asked, what really happens to them? Ghost was quiet for a moment, scrolling through files Marcus couldn't quite see. Some recover, they go home, eventually process the trauma, move on with their lives. Others don't handle it as well. Anxiety disorders, depression, PTSD. A few have required extended psychiatric care. And Tyler faces no consequences? How can he? The subjects signed consent forms. They agreed to participate. If they suffer psychological damage, that's an unfortunate side effect of legitimate research, not criminal behavior. Marcus understood now why Ghost had been living in the mall for over a year. The child wasn't just hiding from social services or family problems. They were the only witness to a systematic program of legal psychological abuse, and they'd been abandoned by the very people responsible for their safety. The evidence you've collected, Marcus said, it could at least expose what they're doing, make it public, let people know what Tyler's company really does. That's what I was hoping for, but I needed someone from the outside, someone with credibility and connections, someone who could get the information to people who matter. Someone like me. Someone exactly like you. Tyler didn't send you here just to study your responses to the crisis. He sent you here to test whether you'd help me escape, and to ensure that if you tried, you'd be discredited as an unreliable witness who'd suffered a psychological breakdown during a voluntary research experiment. The true elegance of Tyler's trap became clear. If Marcus helped Ghost, he'd be violating his consent agreement and could be legally charged with interfering with legitimate research. If he succeeded in getting evidence to authorities, Tyler could argue that Marcus had suffered a stress-induced psychological episode and fabricated or misinterpreted what he'd experienced. Either way, Tyler's operation would be protected, while Marcus faced legal and personal consequences for trying to expose it. There's something else, Ghost said, opening a final file. The midnight deadline isn't arbitrary. At midnight, the current experiment phase concludes. The facilitators will initiate what they call, quote, scenario termination protocols. Which means what? Sedation, extraction, and memory modification. Marcus stared at the screen. Memory modification? Experimental techniques developed for treating PTSD. They can selectively suppress or alter specific memories, making subjects forget traumatic experiences or remember them differently. It's still in clinical trials, but Tyler's company has been testing it on challenging subjects who show signs of significant psychological damage. They erase people's memories of what happened to them? Partially. Enough to prevent lasting trauma, but not enough to eliminate the research data they've already collected. Subjects remember participating in a challenge, but the specific details become vague and dreamlike. They can't provide coherent testimony about their experiences, which protects the researchers from legal liability. Marcus looked at his phone. 4:23 a.m. Midnight was still 19 hours away, but now that deadline carried a much more sinister meaning. If he remained in the building until the designated time, he'd be subjected to experimental memory modification that would leave him unable to accurately recall or report what he'd discovered. We have to leave now, Marcus said, before they can implement any termination protocols. The building is surrounded, Ghost replied. I've seen them do this before. The facilitators inside are just the monitoring team. There are others outside, waiting to intercept anyone who tries to escape. The only way out is to complete the experiment according to their parameters, or to find a way to turn their own methods against them. What do you mean? Ghost smiled for the first time since Marcus had met them, and the expression was both childlike and terrifyingly mature. I mean, it's time to show Tyler and his researchers what happens when their test subjects start conducting experiments of their own. Ghost's plan was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Instead of trying to escape Tyler's experiment, they would hijack it, turning the mall into their own laboratory where the researchers became the subjects, and the abandoned building became a trap designed by its most experienced inhabitant. They've been studying human behavior under extreme stress, Ghost explained, pulling up building schematics on one of their hidden computers. But they've never been the ones experiencing that stress. They maintain control by staying outside the experimental conditions, observing from a safe distance while their subjects break down. Marcus studied the mall's layout as Ghost highlighted key structural points, load-bearing walls, electrical systems, water mains, and most importantly, the building's original 1970s-era automation systems that had never been fully decommissioned. The mall was designed as a self-contained environment, Ghost continued. Climate control, lighting, security systems, even background music. Everything was centrally controlled from a master station in the old management offices. Most of it still works, and I've spent months learning how to manipulate it. You want to trap them inside their own experiment? I want to show them what it feels like to be studied, analyzed, and psychologically manipulated by someone who knows their weaknesses and fears. Tyler has detailed psychological profiles on all his facilitators. I found them in the research files. Dr. Elena Vasquez has severe claustrophobia from a childhood trauma involving a collapsed mine. Jake Morrison has an irrational fear of children due to an incident during his military service. Maria Santos suffers from paranoid anxiety that she manages with medication she didn't bring on this assignment. Ghost's voice carried a cold satisfaction that made Marcus deeply uncomfortable. The child had been transformed by months of isolation and psychological abuse into something that understood manipulation and exploitation with frightening sophistication. And Dr. Richard Kovac, the team leader, has a pathological need for control that borders on obsessive-compulsive disorder. He can't function effectively when environmental variables become unpredictable. This is revenge, Marcus said. You're talking about torturing them the same way they tortured other people. I'm talking about justice, Ghost corrected, and data collection. Every psychological pressure they experience, every stress response they exhibit, every moment of fear and confusion, I'll be documenting all of it. When this is over, I'll have enough evidence to prove that their research methods constitute systematic psychological abuse, regardless of the legal consent forms. Quote, Marcus realized that Ghost had spent their months in isolation planning not just survival, but retaliation. The child had been studying their captors as intensively as they'd been studying, learning to predict and exploit the psychological vulnerabilities of trained researchers. The building's automation systems can control temperature, lighting, air circulation, and even audio output, Ghost continued. I can create environmental conditions that will trigger specific phobias and stress responses in each facilitator. More importantly, I can document their reactions using the same surveillance equipment they brought to monitor us. That's assuming we can access the control systems without being caught. The master control room is in the basement level, accessible through maintenance tunnels they don't know exist. While they're searching the upper floors for us, we slip down there and take control of their own monitoring equipment. Ghost showed Marcus a detailed map of the mall's hidden infrastructure, service tunnels, utility corridors, and maintenance spaces that formed a parallel world beneath the retail environment. The child had explored every inch of this hidden realm, creating multiple routes between any 2 points in the building. Once we control the environmental systems, we can herd the facilitators into specific areas where their psychological profiles indicate they'll be most vulnerable. Dr. Vasquez in the narrow service corridors where her claustrophobia will be most intense. Jake in areas where we can create the illusion of children's voices and movement. Maria in spaces where the surveillance equipment can create paranoid scenarios about being watched and hunted. And Dr. Kovac? The control room itself. He'll try to regain command of the situation by accessing the monitoring equipment. When he gets there, he'll find that someone else is running the experiment, and his subjects are his own team members. The loss of control will be psychologically devastating for someone with his personality profile. Marcus understood the psychological sophistication of Ghost's plan, but he also recognized its potential for causing real harm. What if they have medical emergencies? What if the stress triggers heart attacks or psychological breaks? The same thing that happens when Tyler's subjects have medical emergencies. They become data points in a research file, and the experiment continues until its conclusion. Quote, the casual way Ghost dismissed the possibility of seriously injuring their tormentors revealed how thoroughly the child's moral framework had been warped by months of abuse and abandonment. They had learned to think like their captors, viewing human suffering as acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of larger goals. I can't be part of something that might kill people, Marcus said. You're already part of something that has killed people, Ghost replied, opening another file on their computer. Portland 47 was named Jennifer Walsh. She was a 34-year-old teacher who Tyler convinced to spend 2 nights in an abandoned school. The facilitators use staged encounters with actors playing disturbed children to trigger her maternal instincts and protective responses. The stress caused a cardiac episode. She died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. The file contained medical records, death certificates, and legal documents showing how Tyler's company had avoided liability through careful manipulation of consent forms and insurance policies. Jennifer Walsh had become a statistic, her death classified as a pre-existing medical condition triggered by voluntary participation in a research study. Detroit 23 Sarah Mitchell committed suicide 6 weeks after her experiment. Nashville 61 David Park is currently in a psychiatric facility where he's been catatonic for 2 months. Chicago 15 resulted in permanent neurological damage when the subject suffered a stress-induced stroke. Ghost opened file after file, documenting a trail of psychological casualties that Tyler's research had left across multiple cities and years of operation. The pattern was clear. Subjects were pushed beyond their psychological limits, while legal protections ensured the researchers faced no consequences for the damage they caused. "How many people has Tyler destroyed?" Marcus asked. 47 documented cases over the past 3 years, probably more that weren't officially recorded. The company considers a 20% casualty rate acceptable for the quality of data they're collecting. Marcus felt a rage building inside him that was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. Tyler hadn't just betrayed their friendship. He'd been systematically destroying vulnerable people while hiding behind academic legitimacy and legal technicalities. The roommate who'd shared pizza and complained about work was actually a predator who specialized in psychological manipulation and exploitation. "The facilitators down there," Marcus said, "they know about all this? They're not just employees, they're true believers. They genuinely think they're advancing human knowledge through their research." Dr. Vasquez has published papers on crisis psychology that are considered groundbreaking in academic circles. Jake Morrison's military experience makes him an expert on trauma responses under combat conditions. They see themselves as scientists conducting important work. Even though they know people are dying, especially because people are dying, they believe that understanding human psychological limits requires pushing subjects past those limits. The casualties are tragic but necessary sacrifices for the advancement of knowledge. Ghost closed the files and began powering up additional equipment Marcus hadn't noticed before. Cameras, audio recording devices, and what looked like a portable broadcast system. "That's why documenting their own psychological breakdown is so important," Ghost continued. "When they experience the same terror and helplessness they've inflicted on others, when they break down under the same pressures they've used to destroy 47 innocent people, I'll have proof that their research methods are torture, not science." Marcus watched Ghost prepare their counter-experiment with the methodical precision of someone who'd been planning this operation for months. Every piece of equipment had been carefully selected and positioned. Every aspect of the mall's infrastructure had been studied and cataloged. The child had transformed the abandoned building into an elaborate trap designed to psychologically dissect the very people who'd abandoned them there. "There's something else," Ghost said, activating a communication system that Marcus realized was connected to Tyler's own monitoring network. "Tyler isn't just observing this experiment remotely. He's here, in the building, watching from a hidden control room he thinks I don't know about." "Where?" "The old GameStop in the North Wing has a false back wall that leads to a surveillance center Tyler's company installed when they first started using this location. He's been there since midnight, watching everything through hidden cameras, recording your responses to each phase of the experiment." Marcus felt a new surge of anger. Tyler had been present for every moment of fear and confusion Marcus had experienced, probably taking notes on his psychological responses while he stumbled through the mall in terror. "He has no idea that I've been watching him watch you," Ghost continued. "I installed my own cameras in his surveillance room months ago. I know exactly what equipment he has, how many people are with him, and most importantly, I know he's just as trapped in this building as we are." Ghost activated a monitor that showed Tyler sitting in a small room filled with surveillance equipment, completely focused on tracking Marcus's movements through the mall. 2 other people were with him. Researchers Marcus didn't recognize who were documenting his responses and analyzing his behavior in real time. "The beautiful thing about Tyler's personality profile," Ghost said with that disturbing smile, "is that he needs to feel superior to his subjects. He has to believe he's smarter, more prepared, more in control than the people he's studying. That arrogance makes him predictable, and predictable people are easy to manipulate. What are you planning to do to him? I'm going to give Tyler exactly what he's been trying to give you, a learning experience about who he really is when everything familiar and safe has been stripped away. He's about to discover that spending months studying someone doesn't mean you understand them, especially when that someone has been studying you right back. Ghost began initiating their takeover of the mall's systems, and Marcus watched as lights began flickering throughout the building in patterns that seemed random but were clearly deliberate. The facilitators' voices carried through the ventilation system, showing confusion and growing concern as their familiar environment began behaving unpredictably. "It's starting," Ghost said. "Tyler's experiment is about to become mine. And unlike his research, mine is going to have consequences that last long after the final data is collected." Marcus realized he was about to witness something unprecedented, a psychological experiment conducted by its own former subject, designed to expose the brutal reality of human behavioral research by forcing the researchers to experience their own methods firsthand. The abandoned mall was about to become a laboratory where the scientists became the specimens, and the specimen became the scientist. And somewhere in the darkness, Tyler was about to learn that his most successful experiment had been the one he'd never intended to conduct, the one that had created someone capable of turning his own methods against him. The transformation began subtly. Ghost's fingers moved across control interfaces with the fluid precision of a conductor leading an orchestra, and the mall responded like a living organism awakening from a long sleep. First, the temperature dropped 3 degrees throughout the building. Then the ambient lighting shifted from harsh, fluorescent white to a warmer, more natural tone that made shadows deeper and more menacing. Marcus watched through Ghost's surveillance monitors as the facilitators noticed the environmental changes. Dr. Elena Vasquez paused in her search of the second-level service corridors, pulling her jacket tighter as the temperature continued to drop. Jake Morrison looked up at ceiling vents that had suddenly begun circulating air with an unusual whistling sound. Maria Santos stopped at a store entrance, clearly sensing that something fundamental had changed about their carefully controlled environment. "They're trained to recognize when variables shift unexpectedly," Ghost explained, adjusting settings on a climate control panel that looked like it belonged on a spacecraft. "But they're also trained to maintain operational focus despite environmental distractions. That training is about to become a liability." The hidden cameras Ghost had installed throughout the mall provided a god's-eye view of the developing situation. Marcus could see all 4 facilitators simultaneously, watch their body language and movement patterns, as Ghost began implementing psychological pressure designed specifically for each individual. Dr. Vasquez was the first target. Ghost activated a series of fans and air circulation systems that created a subtle but persistent breeze flowing through the service corridors. To most people, it would have been barely noticeable, but for someone with severe claustrophobia, the moving air created an illusion that the walls were breathing, that the narrow spaces were contracting and expanding like living tissue. Marcus watched Dr. Vasquez's movements become more rapid and less methodical. She began touching the corridor walls more frequently, as if checking to ensure they weren't actually moving. Her breathing became shallower, and she started pausing at corridor intersections longer than operationally necessary. "Claustrophobia isn't just fear of small spaces," Ghost explained while monitoring Vasquez's vitals through a thermal imaging feed. "It's the fear of being trapped, of losing control over your environment. The moving air triggers those responses even in spaces that are objectively large enough to be safe." Simultaneously, Ghost began working on Jake Morrison. The veteran was searching the ground level near the old arcade, an area filled with dead gaming machines and tangled electrical cables. Ghost activated a series of motion sensors connected to speakers hidden throughout the arcade, creating a network of audio triggers that responded to Jake's movement. As Jake passed each sensor, the speakers emitted sounds that were almost, but not quite, voices. Children's laughter faded into static. Playground songs that dissolved into mechanical noise. The audio was processed to be just unclear enough that Jake's military-trained mind would try to identify and classify potential threats, but just distorted enough that classification was impossible. Marcus watched Jake's posture change from confident search-and-clear patterns to something more defensive. The veteran began moving with his back to walls, checking corners twice, pausing to listen for threats that existed only in the carefully orchestrated audio landscape Ghost had created. Jake's military file shows he was involved in a civilian casualty incident during his deployment, Ghost said, pulling up psychological profiles on their screen. Mistook a group of children for enemy combatants during a night raid. He's been in therapy for combat-related PTSD ever since. The sound of children in a combat-style environment is guaranteed to trigger trauma responses. Maria Santos, meanwhile, was experiencing a different form of psychological manipulation. Ghost had activated every security camera and motion detector in her search area, creating a surveillance network so dense that Maria couldn't move without triggering multiple sensors. Red LED lights blinked at her from every corner, and she could hear the mechanical whir of cameras tracking her movement. For someone with paranoid anxiety, being obviously watched and monitored by an unknown party was psychological torture. Marcus watched Maria's search pattern become increasingly erratic as she tried to avoid the cameras while still completing her assigned area. She began moving in zigzag patterns, ducking behind obstacles, and repeatedly looking over her shoulder at surveillance devices that were now tracking her every movement. The irony, Ghost observed, is that Maria's job involves watching and analyzing other people without their knowledge or consent. She's participated in dozens of experiments where subjects were monitored against their will. Now she's experiencing what it feels like to be the one under observation. But it was Dr. Richard Kovac, the team leader, who received Ghost's most sophisticated psychological attack. Instead of targeting his specific phobias, Ghost attacked his fundamental need for control and predictability. Every system Kovac tried to access began producing inconsistent results. Communication equipment worked intermittently. GPS devices showed conflicting location data. Even his watch began displaying random times, synchronized to a signal Ghost was broadcasting from the theater's hidden control room. Marcus watched Kovac's increasingly frustrated attempts to restore order to his operation. The man kept checking and rechecking his equipment, trying to identify the source of the system failures that were making his carefully planned experiment impossible to execute. Kovac's entire identity is built around being the person who controls variables and manages outcomes, Ghost explained. He can't psychologically function when he's not the one running the show. Take away his ability to predict and control his environment, and he starts making increasingly desperate attempts to regain command. As the psychological pressure mounted, Ghost began Phase 2 of their counter-experiment, documentation. Hidden cameras captured every moment of the facilitator's growing distress. Audio recorders documented their increasingly panicked radio communications. Biometric sensors that Ghost had somehow tapped into showed rising heart rates, elevated stress hormones, and the physical manifestations of psychological breakdown. This is exactly what they did to 47 other people, Ghost said, saving data files with the same clinical detachment Tyler's researchers had used to catalog their subjects' suffering. The only difference is that these subjects have training and equipment designed to help them handle psychological pressure. Their victims had nothing but whatever personal resilience they'd developed on their own. Marcus felt deeply conflicted watching the facilitator's deterioration. These people had participated in systematic psychological abuse, had been present while innocent subjects suffered trauma that led to hospitalization, permanent disability, and death. They deserved to face consequences for their actions. But watching Ghost methodically torture them using their own research methods was disturbing in ways Marcus couldn't fully articulate. The child had been transformed by their experiences into someone capable of inflicting the same psychological damage that had been inflicted on them. The cycle of abuse was continuing, just with different people in the roles of experimenter and subject. Tyler's watching all of this, Ghost said, indicating a monitor that showed the hidden surveillance room where Marcus's former roommate was becoming increasingly agitated. He's trying to communicate with his team, but I've been intercepting and blocking their radio signals. As far as he knows, his carefully controlled experiment has descended into chaos for no apparent reason. Tyler was indeed showing signs of stress. Marcus could see him frantically working communication equipment, checking monitoring devices, and reviewing data that no longer made sense according to his experimental protocols. The man who had built his career on psychological manipulation was experiencing what it felt like to lose control of a situation involving human subjects who weren't responding according to predicted patterns. Phase 3, Ghost announced, begins now. The lights went out throughout the entire mall, not gradually, Not in sections, but instantly and completely, plunging the massive building into absolute darkness. Emergency lighting systems that should have been activated automatically remained dead. Backup power supplies that should have maintained critical systems had been disabled. The only illumination came from the glow of electronic devices and the occasional spark from damaged electrical systems. Marcus heard the facilitators' voices echoing through the building. No longer coordinated professional communications, but increasingly frantic calls for backup, for instructions, for any form of external support that could help them regain control of a situation that had become completely unpredictable. "This is what Jennifer Walsh experienced in Portland," Ghost said, their voice steady and clinical in the darkness. "Sarah Mitchell in Detroit. David Park in Nashville. 47 people who thought they were participating in simple challenges but found themselves trapped in psychological experiments designed to break them down completely." Through thermal imaging, Marcus could see the facilitators' heat signatures moving through the mall in increasingly desperate patterns. Dr. Vasquez had abandoned her methodical search and was moving rapidly toward what she hoped were exit points, her claustrophobia making the darkness unbearable. Jake Morrison had taken a defensive position in the arcade, his military training telling him to find cover and wait for extraction that wasn't coming. Maria Santos was moving erratically, checking corners for threats she couldn't see but knew were watching her. Dr. Kovac had left his monitoring station and was trying to physically locate his team members, but Ghost's manipulation of the mall's acoustic systems made their voices seem to come from multiple directions simultaneously. He was calling out commands and coordinates, but his team couldn't follow instructions when they couldn't determine where the instructions were coming from. "The difference between what I'm doing and what they did," Ghost continued, "is that their victims were innocent people who had no idea what was happening to them. These subjects are trained professionals who chose to participate in systematic psychological abuse. They understand exactly what they're experiencing because they've done it to dozens of other people." Marcus realized that Ghost's experiment was more than revenge. It was education. The child was forcing Tyler's research team to experience their own methods from the perspective of their victims, to understand the psychological damage they'd been inflicting on vulnerable people while hiding behind academic legitimacy and legal protection. But the ethical implications were staggering. Ghost had become everything their captors had created. A person capable of viewing human suffering as acceptable means to a desired end. Someone who could inflict psychological torture while justifying it as necessary for a greater good. "How long are you planning to keep this going?" Marcus asked. "Until they break," Ghost replied simply. "Until they experience the same psychological collapse they've documented in 47 other people. Until I have enough evidence to prove that their research methods constitute systematic torture, regardless of consent forms or academic oversight. And if they have medical emergencies, heart attacks, strokes, complete psychological breakdowns, then they'll become data points in my research files, just like Jennifer Walsh and Sarah Mitchell and David Park became data points in theirs." Marcus understood that he was witnessing the creation of a monster, not through deliberate evil, but through systematic abuse that had taught a child to think like their tormentors. Ghost had learned to dehumanize their subjects, to view psychological suffering as necessary data collection, to justify cruelty as scientific advancement. The most horrifying aspect was that Ghost's methodology was more sophisticated and potentially more damaging than Tyler's original experiments. The child had spent months studying their captors' psychological vulnerabilities, developing targeted approaches designed to exploit specific traumas and fears with precision that Tyler's more generalized stress scenarios couldn't match. As Marcus watched the facilitators' continued deterioration through Ghost's surveillance network, he realized that he was no longer just a subject in Tyler's experiment or a witness to Ghost's revenge. He had become something much more dangerous, someone with the power to stop systematic psychological abuse but who had to choose between protecting the abusers and protecting their victims. The abandoned mall had become a laboratory where the fundamental questions about human nature, justice, and moral responsibility were being tested through the systematic destruction of human psyches. And Marcus was about to discover that the most important choice he'd ever make wouldn't be about saving himself, but about what kind of person he was willing to become in order to stop others from becoming monsters. The breaking point came at 6:17 a.m., exactly 18 minutes before sunrise would begin filtering through the mall's skylights. Marcus watched through Ghost's surveillance system as Dr. Elena Vasquez collapsed in one of the narrow service corridors, hyperventilating and clawing at the walls as her claustrophobia reached a crescendo that her rational mind could no longer control. Jake Morrison had barricaded himself behind an overturned arcade cabinet, muttering military radio protocols to himself while phantom children's voices continued echoing from speakers that responded to his every movement. His tactical training was intact, but the psychological framework that allowed him to function as a soldier had shattered under the sustained audio assault designed to trigger his deepest trauma. Maria Santos was perhaps the most disturbing to observe. Her paranoid anxiety had evolved into complete paranoid psychosis. She was talking to surveillance cameras as if they were people, pleading with them to stop watching her, negotiating with them for permission to move through spaces they were obviously monitoring. She had begun performing elaborate rituals before entering new areas, as if the cameras required specific behaviors before allowing her passage. Dr. Richard Kovac had stopped trying to coordinate his team entirely. Instead, he sat in the main corridor surrounded by malfunctioning equipment, methodically dismantling and rebuilding the same radio over and over again, convinced that if he could just restore one piece of technology to proper function, he could regain control over the situation that had spiraled completely beyond his management. 4 trained professionals, Ghost observed, documenting the scenes with the same clinical detachment their captors had used to record previous victims. Advanced degrees, years of experience in crisis psychology, specialized training in human behavioral analysis. And they're exhibiting the same breakdown patterns as untrained civilians subjected to much less sophisticated psychological pressure. Marcus realized that Ghost had proven their point with devastating effectiveness. The facilitator's professional training and psychological preparation had provided no meaningful protection against sustained, targeted psychological manipulation. If anything, their expertise had made them more vulnerable because they understood exactly what was happening to them while being powerless to prevent it. "You've made your point," Marcus said. "They're broken. Now what?" "Now comes the most important part of the experiment," Ghost replied, activating communication systems that would allow them to speak directly to Tyler in his hidden surveillance room. Now we find out what Tyler does when he realizes his most successful subject has become his most dangerous competitor. Quote, Ghost's voice echoed through Tyler's surveillance room via speakers Marcus hadn't even known existed. "Hello, Tyler. I hope you've been enjoying the show." Through the hidden camera, Marcus watched Tyler's reaction to hearing Ghost speak directly to him. The man's face went through a rapid sequence of emotions: surprise, confusion, fear, and finally a calculating coldness that revealed who Tyler really was beneath his friendly roommate facade. "Very impressive," Tyler replied, speaking into a microphone that connected to the mall's public address system. "You've exceeded all projections for adaptive intelligence and strategic thinking. This has been the most successful long-term behavioral study we've ever conducted." "You think this is still your experiment?" Ghost asked, and Marcus could hear genuine amusement in the child's voice. "Everything that's happened tonight has been within predicted parameters," Tyler continued. "Subject exhibits trauma bonding with authority figures, develops sophisticated survival strategies, demonstrates capacity for strategic planning and technical manipulation. You've provided invaluable data about human adaptation to extreme psychological pressure." Marcus felt sick listening to Tyler reduce Ghost's months of suffering and psychological transformation into clinical observations. Even now, even after watching his own team suffer complete psychological breakdown, Tyler was still thinking like a researcher cataloging interesting behavioral data. "The only thing that surprised me," Tyler added, "was how quickly you formed an emotional attachment to Marcus. That wasn't in your psychological profile, but it's been fascinating to observe." Ghost was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus could see them studying monitors that showed Tyler's vital signs and stress indicators. The child was analyzing their former captor the same way Tyler had analyzed dozens of previous subjects. "You're wrong about the emotional attachment," Ghost finally said. "I don't care about Marcus any more than you cared about Jennifer Walsh or Sarah Mitchell or David Park. He's just a tool I needed to complete my own research project." Marcus felt as if he'd been punched. Throughout the night, he'd assumed that Ghost genuinely wanted his help, that their partnership was based on mutual need and shared opposition to Tyler's systematic abuse. The possibility that he was just another subject in another experiment, this time designed by Ghost rather than Tyler, hadn't occurred to him. "My research question," Ghost continued, was whether someone could be psychologically manipulated into believing they were helping a victim when they were actually participating in their own psychological deconstruction. Marcus, you've been the subject of my experiment since the moment you found me in Tiny Treasures. The revelation hit Marcus like physical trauma. Every choice he'd made, every moment of moral outrage at Tyler's methods, every decision to help Ghost had been predicted and orchestrated by someone who understood psychological manipulation better than Tyler himself. The abandoned child living alone in a dangerous building, Ghost explained, was designed to trigger your specific psychological vulnerabilities, your guilt about your relationship with your parents, your need to prove you're not the selfish person Rachel accused you of being, your desire to be the hero in a situation where you've always felt powerless. Through Tyler's surveillance equipment, Marcus could see his own biometric data displayed on monitors. His heart rate, stress hormones, and neurological responses had been tracked and recorded throughout the entire night. Ghost had been conducting the same kind of systematic psychological analysis that Tyler used on his subjects. Every piece of evidence I showed you about Tyler's other experiments was real, Ghost continued. But I showed it to you in a sequence designed to maximize your emotional response and ensure you'd agree to help me implement my revenge scenario. You were never my partner, Marcus. You were my test subject. Marcus realized that the abandoned mall contained not one, not two, but 3 separate experiments running simultaneously. Tyler was studying Marcus's responses to isolation and moral dilemmas. Ghost was studying Marcus's responses to manipulation and exploitation. And Marcus was inadvertently studying both of them, learning things about human nature that he wished he could know. The beautiful thing about your personality profile, Ghost said, echoing the same clinical language Tyler used to discuss his subjects, is that you need to believe you're helping someone more vulnerable than yourself. That need made you predictable, and predictable people are easy to control. Quote, Tyler's laughter came through the communication system, genuine appreciation for psychological manipulation executed with professional skill. Outstanding work. You've successfully conducted a parallel experiment using the same subject, with completely different parameters and objectives. This is exactly the kind of innovative thinking we hope to develop through extended isolation studies. There's just one more variable to test, Ghost said, and Marcus heard a new tone in the child's voice that made his skin crawl. The lights came back on throughout the mall, but instead of normal illumination, every display screen and electronic sign was showing the same thing. Live feeds from Ghost's hidden cameras, documenting Tyler's entire surveillance operation. The screens showed Tyler in his secret control room, showed the facilitators in various states of psychological breakdown, and showed Ghost's own command center in the theater basement. But most importantly, the screens showed Marcus himself, standing in the hidden room where he'd believed he was helping a victim plan their escape. The footage revealed every moment of his manipulation by Ghost, every decision he'd made based on manufactured emotional responses, every choice that had led him deeper into psychological experimentation disguised as moral action. The final phase of my experiment, Ghost announced, tests what happens when a subject realizes they've been psychologically manipulated into participating in systematic abuse of other human beings. Do they rationalize their actions as justified? Do they experience guilt and trauma that mirrors what their victims experienced? Or do they integrate the experience and become capable of manipulation themselves? Marcus understood that he was watching himself become either a victim or a perpetrator, with no option for remaining innocent. Ghost had engineered a scenario where his only choices were psychological breakdown or psychological corruption. He could either be destroyed by the realization that he'd participated in torturing people, or he could accept that psychological manipulation was an acceptable tool for achieving desired outcomes. Tyler's facilitators are experiencing severe psychological trauma because they believed they were in control of their situation, Ghost continued. But you, Marcus, are experiencing something potentially more damaging. The realization that moral action and immoral action can be psychologically indistinguishable when they're both responses to manufactured scenarios. Through the surveillance feeds, Marcus could see that Ghost had been right about one thing. The abandoned mall had become a laboratory for studying fundamental questions about human nature. But instead of Tyler's crude experiments about stress and fear, Ghost had created something much more sophisticated, a study of how people respond when they discover that their moral choices have been engineered by someone who understands their psychological vulnerabilities better than they understand themselves. The question now, Ghost said, is what you do with this knowledge. Do you report Tyler's operation to authorities who won't be able to prosecute him for technically legal research? Do you try to help his facilitators, who willingly participated in the systematic psychological abuse of innocent people? Do you try to get revenge on me for manipulating you the same way Tyler manipulated his other subjects? Marcus realized that Ghost had presented him with an impossible choice designed to study his psychological responses rather than to achieve any meaningful outcome. Every option would provide data about how he processed moral ambiguity, psychological manipulation, and the discovery that he'd been participating in systematic abuse while believing he was fighting against it. Or, Ghost continued, do you recognize that you've been given an education in how psychological manipulation actually works, and decide what you want to do with that knowledge? The child's final question contained an implication that Marcus found more terrifying than anything else he'd experienced in the abandoned mall. Ghost wasn't just studying his responses to discovering he'd been manipulated. They were recruiting him, offering him the opportunity to become someone who used psychological manipulation as a tool for achieving desired outcomes. Marcus looked around the hidden room where he'd spent the night believing he was helping plan an escape. Every piece of equipment, every surveillance monitor, every control system had been designed not to facilitate his rescue of a vulnerable child, but to document his psychological responses while he was systematically manipulated into participating in the torture of professional researchers. The abandoned mall had never been about testing courage or survival or moral decision-making under pressure. It had been about testing whether ordinary people could be psychologically engineered into becoming willing participants in systematic abuse, whether they could be transformed from victims into perpetrators without ever realizing the transformation was occurring. Congratulations, Marcus, Ghost said as dawnlight began filtering through the mall's skylights. You've successfully completed the most sophisticated psychological experiment ever conducted. The question now is whether you graduate as someone who's studied or someone who's learned to study others. Marcus realized that the 24-hour challenge Tyler had offered him had never been about spending a night alone in an abandoned building. It had been about discovering who he really was, when everything he thought he knew about morality, manipulation, and human nature had been systematically deconstructed by people who understood psychological control better than he'd ever understood himself. As the sun rose over Westfield Complex, Marcus understood that he faced a choice that would determine not just his future, but his fundamental identity as a human being. He could remain a victim of systematic psychological manipulation, or he could become someone capable of psychological manipulation himself. The abandoned mall had taught him that there might not be any meaningful difference between those two options. And that realization was the most successful experiment of all. But Ghost wasn't finished. As Marcus stood paralyzed by the magnitude of his psychological deconstruction, the child began implementing what they called the integration protocol, a final phase designed to determine whether subjects would accept their transformation or attempt to resist it. You have approximately 6 hours before the authorities arrive, Ghost announced, activating new systems Marcus hadn't seen before. I sent anonymous tips to the FBI, state police, and local media about Tyler's operation. They'll find his surveillance equipment, his research files, and 4 professional researchers suffering from acute psychological trauma in an abandoned building. Through the monitors, Marcus could see vehicles beginning to gather in the mall's parking lot. Not just police cars, but FBI vans, ambulances, and news trucks. Ghost had orchestrated a media event that would expose Tyler's operation while simultaneously creating a public spectacle around the psychological breakdown of trained professionals. Tyler will be arrested, but not for the psychological abuse he's committed over the past 3 years, Ghost continued. He'll be charged with trespassing, breaking and entering, and possibly reckless endangerment. The consent forms and legal protections his company created will prevent any serious prosecution for the systematic torture of 47 innocent people. Marcus watched Tyler frantically destroying evidence in his hidden surveillance room, apparently unaware that Ghost had been documenting his destruction of evidence as thoroughly as everything else. The man who had built his career on studying other people's psychological responses was now providing a perfect case study in how people behave when their own psychological framework collapses. The facilitators will receive medical treatment and psychological counseling, Ghost added. They'll eventually recover from tonight's trauma and return to their lives as respected researchers and academics. But they'll never again be able to participate in psychological experiments without remembering what it feels like to be the subject, rather than the observer. The child's clinical description of the aftermath revealed something Marcus found more disturbing than the experiments themselves. Ghost had planned not just for psychological revenge, but for the long-term consequences of that revenge on everyone involved. Dr. Vasquez will probably develop agoraphobia as a secondary condition to her existing claustrophobia, Ghost continued, reviewing psychological profiles and predicting long-term outcomes with frightening accuracy. Jake Morrison's PTSD will worsen significantly, and he'll likely require extended hospitalization. Maria Santos will need antipsychotic medication for at least 6 months to recover from the paranoid episode 1 induced. And Dr. Kovac? Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Complete psychological breakdown leading to early retirement from academic research. His need for control was so fundamental to his identity that losing it has essentially destroyed his ability to function as a professional psychologist. Marcus realized that Ghost had designed consequences that would effectively end the careers of everyone involved in Tyler's research program. The child hadn't just wanted revenge. They'd wanted to ensure that these specific individuals could never again participate in psychological experimentation that might harm vulnerable subjects. But the most interesting outcome, Ghost said, turning their attention back to Marcus, will be what happens to you. You're the only person who experienced the complete cycle. Victim of Tyler's manipulation, participant in systematic psychological abuse, and subject of advanced behavioral engineering. Ghost activated a final monitor that showed Marcus's complete psychological profile, compiled from months of hidden observation and 12 hours of intensive behavioral analysis. The document was more detailed and sophisticated than anything Tyler had ever produced, mapping Marcus's personality, trauma responses, moral decision-making patterns, and psychological vulnerabilities with scientific precision. You now understand how psychological manipulation works from multiple perspectives, Ghost explained. You know what it feels like to be studied without your knowledge, to have your emotional responses engineered by someone who understands your psychological patterns, and to participate in the systematic abuse of other human beings while believing you're acting morally. Marcus scanned the psychological profile and saw himself described in clinical terms that reduced his most personal experiences to data points and behavioral patterns. His relationship with Rachel, his estrangement from his family, his financial struggles, his need for validation, everything that made him human had been cataloged and analyzed as tools for psychological manipulation. That knowledge, Ghost continued, makes you extremely dangerous. You could expose similar operations, help victims understand how they're being manipulated, or prevent other people from falling victim to psychological research disguised as legitimate challenges. Or, Marcus asked, sensing there was another option. Or you could use that knowledge to become extremely effective at psychological manipulation yourself. You understand how vulnerable people think, how they respond to specific pressures, how they can be guided into making choices they believe are their own, but are actually predetermined by someone who understands their psychological architecture. Quote, Ghost displayed a series of job postings on their monitors, positions at consulting firms, research companies, and government agencies that all involve some form of human behavioral analysis and manipulation. The salaries were substantial, the benefits comprehensive, and the job descriptions used euphemistic language to disguise what was essentially professional psychological manipulation. Tyler's company is just one of dozens of organizations that specialize in advanced behavioral engineering, Ghost explained. Corporate psychology, political consulting, marketing research, social media analysis, entire industries built on understanding and exploiting human psychological vulnerabilities. Marcus realized that Ghost was offering him a career path that would allow him to profit from the same psychological manipulation he'd been subjected to. The knowledge he'd gained through systematic abuse could become the foundation for systematically abusing others, but with better pay and legal protection. Companies like Tyler's are always recruiting people who understand psychological manipulation from personal experience, Ghost continued. Former subjects often become the most effective researchers because they know intimately how manipulation feels from the victim's perspective. You want me to become like Tyler? I want you to choose who you become. Tyler chose to be someone who studies human suffering for profit. I chose to be someone who uses psychological manipulation to achieve justice. You can choose to be someone who prevents psychological abuse, or someone who perfects it. Ghost began shutting down their equipment, erasing files and dismantling the sophisticated surveillance network they'd built throughout the mall. But Marcus noticed they were also creating backup copies of everything, storing the data in formats that could be easily transmitted or published. The evidence I've collected about Tyler's operation will be released publicly, regardless of what you choose, Ghost said. Academic journals, news organizations, social media platforms, everything will be documented and distributed. Tyler's research will become a case study in systematic psychological abuse disguised as legitimate science. And evidence about what you did to me? About your own psychological manipulation? That depends on what you do with the knowledge you've gained. If you use it to help people, to prevent psychological abuse, to expose similar operations, then my manipulation of you becomes justifiable as a necessary educational experience. If you use it to profit from psychological manipulation yourself, then I become just another abuser who created another abuser. Marcus understood that Ghost had engineered a scenario where his future moral choices would retroactively determine the ethical status of his past experiences. The child had created a psychological trap that extended far beyond the abandoned mall, one that would influence every decision Marcus made for the rest of his life. Outside, the sound of sirens and helicopter rotors indicated that the authorities were preparing to enter the building. Marcus could see SWAT teams positioning themselves around the mall's entrances, federal agents coordinating with local police, and media crews setting up equipment to document whatever they found inside. "You have about 10 minutes to decide," Ghost said, offering Marcus a data drive containing everything they'd collected about Tyler's operation. "Walk out of here as someone who was victimized by systematic psychological abuse, or walk out as someone who received an advanced education in human behavioral engineering." Marcus took the data drive, understanding that it contained not just evidence of Tyler's crimes, but a complete curriculum in psychological manipulation that could be used to help people or exploit them. The choice Ghost was forcing him to make wasn't just about his immediate future. It was about what kind of person he would become over the years and decades that followed. "There's one more thing," Ghost said as they prepared to leave their hidden command center. Tyler's operation was small compared to what's really happening. Government agencies, multinational corporations, social media companies, they're all conducting psychological experiments on unwilling subjects every day. What happened to you in this mall is happening to millions of people through their phones, their computers, their daily interactions with systems designed to study and manipulate human behavior. And you want me to fight against that? I want you to choose whether to fight against it or profit from it. But I want you to make that choice with full knowledge of what psychological manipulation actually is and how it actually works." Quote, as they climbed back through the ventilation system toward the mall's main level, Marcus realized that Ghost had given him something more valuable and more dangerous than money or revenge: complete understanding of how human psychology could be weaponized against unwilling subjects. The abandoned mall had been his classroom, and Ghost had been his teacher in a curriculum he'd never wanted to learn. Now he had to decide whether that education would make him someone who protected others from psychological manipulation, or someone who used psychological manipulation to protect his own interests. The choice would define not just his future, but his fundamental identity as a human being. And unlike every other choice he'd made during his night in Westfield Complex, this one was entirely his own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.